Margaret Ainsworth Vance was sitting at the small writing desk in the back parlor of her own small wooden frame house at the southern edge of the territorial village of Eastbrook on the Central Plains at 20 minutes past 3 on the cold gray afternoon of the 11th of January in 1879, 4 days after her husband's funeral, with the small brass key from the inside pocket of his Sunday wool coat in her right hand and the small wooden drawer of his locked writing desk now open in front of her, looking at a small bundle of papers tied with a thin piece of dark brown twine. The top sheet was dated the 3rd of January in 1879, the day of her husband's death. She had taken it out and had laid it flat on the desk surface, and she had read it through once at her ordinary pace, and then again at the careful, slow pace of a woman being told something by a man who could no longer be asked about it. The sheet was titled at the top in her husband's hand, "A Statement of Personal Debt and Its Origin." Beneath the title was a list of 3 creditors and 3 amounts. Mr. Reuben Stark of the Eastern Territorial Loan Office, $270. The Cattlemen's Bank of the Territorial Capital, $410. Mr. Jonas Pleak, private lender of Bridge Street at the Capitol, $160. Total, $840. Beneath the list in the same hand were 6 paragraphs in which Dr. Thomas Vance had written that he had been borrowing money privately from the 3 named creditors since the winter of 1862, that he had been borrowing to cover the costs of treating poor patients at his medical practice for free without telling her, that he had paid the principal down every year, but the interest had compounded across 17 years to $840, that he had intended to tell her in person and ask her forgiveness, but had never felt strong enough that he was sorry and that he loved her. He had signed the statement at the bottom and had dated it the 3rd of January in 1879. Margaret had read the statement through 3 times. She had folded it carefully and had returned it to the small wooden drawer. She had locked the drawer with a small brass key. She had walked the 4 paces to the kitchen at the front of the small house. She had sat down at the kitchen table. She had not wept. She had been weeping on and off for the previous 8 days, and had no further tears available to her at that moment, and she had instead sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded carefully in front of her in the careful manner of a woman who had been a school teacher in eastern Pennsylvania at the age of 19, and who had married a country doctor at 21, and who had kept the books of his medical practice for 30 years, and who had now, on the 11th of January in 1879 at the age of 51, just discovered that the practice she had kept the books of for 30 years had been running on a quiet private debt her husband had carried for 17 of those years without telling her. The funeral had been on the 7th of January at the small Methodist church at the southern edge of Eastbrook. The Reverend Calder, who had known Thomas Vance for 14 years, had read the burial service. The congregation had been perhaps 60 people. The village's farmers and merchants and their wives, the 2 school teachers from the territorial school, the village postmaster, and a small group of eastern foothills farmers and ranchers whom Thomas had treated across 30 years and who had ridden the 8 miles in for the burial. Margaret had stood at the front pew in her own black wool dress and her dark gray wool shawl, and the small black bonnet she had worn at her own mother's funeral in Pennsylvania 22 years before, with her hands folded carefully in front of her. She had not turned to look at the congregation. She had not noticed the tall, lean Orc man with the bright, vivid emerald green skin, and the long black braid tied back at the nape of his neck, and the wide-brimmed dark felt hat held carefully in both his green-painted hands, who had been standing at the very back of the church, at the rearmost pew, with his back to the back wall and his eyes fixed steady on the small pine coffin at the front. The Orc man had stood at the back for the entire service. He had not joined the procession to the small Methodist plot at the south side of the church. He had left through the back door at the close of the service without speaking to anyone, and he had ridden his small gray mare the half-mile back to the eastern edge of the village where his stone masonry yard stood. Margaret had been 51 years old that January, and she had been the wife of Dr. Thomas Vance for 30 years. She had been born in 1828 on a small Quaker-adjacent farm in eastern Pennsylvania, the only daughter of a Welsh Quaker farmer named Ezra Ainsworth and his Methodist wife, Lavinia. She had taught at the small Friends of Cos school at Westchester for 2 years, between the age of 19 and 21. She had met Thomas Vance at a Methodist church social at Westchester in the summer of 1849. They had married in the spring of 1850 and had ridden west to the Central Plains that summer, and Thomas had hung out his shingle at the front of the small frame house in November of 1850. Margaret had taken on the books of the practice from the first day. She had recorded every transaction from the 1st of November in 1850 through the 3rd of January in 1879. She had not, in any of those 28.5 years, recorded a single dollar of personal debt against the practice or against the household. They had been expecting a child in the autumn of 1851, and she had miscarried in the 7th month. They had been expecting a second in the spring of 1855, and she had miscarried in the 5th. They had been raising a small daughter named Catherine, born in the spring of 1858, who had died of a winter pneumonia in the cold January of 1862 at the age of 4. They had loved each other steadily in the small, careful manner of two people who had buried 3 children together. The first demand letter had arrived at the small wooden post box at the front of the house on the 14th of February in 1879, 6.5 weeks after the funeral. The letter had been from Mr. Reuben Stark of the Eastern Territorial Loan Office at the Territorial Capital, written in a careful clerk's hand on the office's pre-printed letterhead, addressed to Mrs. Margaret Vance, executrix of the estate of Dr. Thomas Vance. The letter had stated, in the formal language of a private lender claiming on an estate, that Dr. Thomas Vance had owed at the time of his death the sum of $270, that the debt had been documented by a signed promissory note in the lender's possession, dated the 12th of November in 1878, that under territorial law of widow's inheritance, the claim now fell to the doctor's widow as the sole heir and executrix, that the widow had 30 days from the date of the letter to respond, and that failure to respond would result in a claim against the estate in the Territorial Circuit Court. The letter had been signed by Mr. Reuben Stark and had been dated the 11th of February. Margaret had read the letter at the kitchen table where she had been eating her supper. She had set down the small piece of bread she had been holding. She had read the letter a second time. She had folded it carefully and had placed it on the table beside the bread. She had finished her supper in the small, careful manner she had been eating for the previous 6 weeks since her husband's death, and she had washed the small plate and the small knife at the basin beside the stove. And she had returned to the kitchen table and had read the letter a third time, and she had then walked to the writing desk in the back parlor and had compared the $270 in the letter against the $270 in her husband's own statement, and they had matched exactly. The second demand letter had arrived on the 21st of February from the Cattlemen's Bank of the Territorial Capital for the sum of $410. The third had arrived on the 2nd of March from Muster Jonas Pleak of Bridge Street at the Territorial Capital for the sum of $160. Each letter had given her 30 days to respond. Each had matched her husband's statement exactly. She had read each 3 times, folded each carefully, and placed all 3 in the small wooden drawer beside her husband's statement. She had then sat at the writing desk in the back parlor for perhaps an hour, in the small gray afternoon light of the 2nd of March, with her hands folded carefully on the desk surface, and she had thought about how she was going to pay the $840. The house was hers, mortgaged to the Cattlemen's Bank for the previous 9 years, with perhaps $400 of remaining mortgage. The medical practice as a going concern was perhaps worth $800 to a younger doctor. Her own savings in the small Eastbrook Savings Society were $83. The household goods and the books and the small medical equipment were perhaps worth $120 at auction. If she sold everything and paid off the mortgage and the $840 of debt, she would be left with no money and no house and no place to live. At the age of 51, 3 months after the death of her husband, she had decided to write the 3 letters of response after supper, offering each creditor a payment plan of $10 a month for the next 7 years against her own labor as a bookkeeper at the village mercantile or as a private teacher for the village children at her kitchen table. She did not know whether they would accept. She had thought, with the careful realism of a woman who had been a school teacher and a bookkeeper for 32 years, that 2 of the 3 probably would not, and that she was probably going to be in territorial circuit court at the county seat by the autumn, and that she was probably going to lose, and that she was probably going to be moving out of the small frame house by the spring of 1880. Corvin of the Marrowstone clan, master stonemason, had been sitting at his small wooden kitchen table at the eastern edge of the village of Eastbrook, adjoining his stonemasonry yard. At perhaps 6 o'clock on the cold gray evening of the 3rd of February in 1879, drinking a small cup of strong black tea, with his wife Sarah of the Marrowstone clan at his elbow. He had been 47 years old that February, a master stonemason for the previous 26 years, at Eastbrook for the previous 11, since he had moved his yard from the eastern foothills to the central plains in 1868. He carved gravestones and wellheads and bridge facings and the small, careful stone foundations of the village's better houses, and he made a good living at it. He had been carrying for the previous 15 years a small, careful piece of clan accounting that he had been waiting to discharge. The piece of clan accounting concerned his wife's mother, Helva of the Marrowstone, who had died in 1873 at the age of 71 at the Marrowstone settlement on the Eastern River, and who had told her daughter Sarah, in the final winter of her life, the story of a country doctor who had treated her at no cost in the winter of 1864 for a broken hip and a secondary infection. The doctor's name had been Thomas Vance. The clan's accounting tradition required that an obligation be discharged, but did not require that it be public. The tradition was that the debt was the family's, and the family was responsible for finding the right moment to discharge it. Helva of the Marrowstone clan had been a clan elder of perhaps 62 years in the winter of 1864, with a small-grown family of 3 adult children at the Marrowstone settlement on the Eastern River, and she had been traveling alone in the eastern foothills in the second week of December of that year on a clan errand of trade in carved stone. She had been riding a small gray mare on the wagon road that ran from the foothills back to the Central Plains on the cold, clear afternoon of the 8th of December in a heavy brown wool traveling coat and a wide-brimmed dark felt hat and brown leather riding boots, when the small gray mare had stepped on a thin sheet of black ice covering the frozen surface of a creek crossing and had slipped sideways and had gone down on her right shoulder, and Helva had been thrown from the saddle and had broken her right hip on a small projecting stone at the edge of the creek. The gray mare had risen unhurt. Helva had lain on the frozen ground for perhaps 4 hours in the cold of the December afternoon before a passing freighter on the wagon road named Owen Gladys had come down the road from the east and had seen the small gray mare standing alone and had stopped and had walked into the small creek bed and had found Helva lying on the frozen ground with her right leg turned at an angle that should not have been possible. Owen Gladys had been a careful man. He had lifted Helva onto the back of her own gray mare carefully, with her broken leg supported on a small bedroll he had carried in his wagon, and he had walked beside the mare the 4 miles down the wagon road to the nearest farmhouse, which had been the small farmhouse of a Methodist family named Brand, who had been keeping the wagon road's only stopping house in the eastern foothills for the previous 9 years. The Brand family had taken Helva in at the kitchen door without question. They had carried her to the small back bedroom. They had sent their oldest son riding the 4 miles further to the small Methodist church at the foothills village where Dr. Thomas Vance had been staying for the previous 3 days while making his winter rounds. Thomas Vance had ridden the 4 miles back to the Brand farmhouse on his own small chestnut mare at the warm gold hour of late afternoon of the 8th of December in 1864. He had been 39 years old in his 14th year of Central Plains practice. He had walked into the small back bedroom. He had seen the elderly Orc woman lying on the bed with her right leg turned at an angle that should not have been possible. He had set down his bag. "Ma'am," he had said, "in the public language, my name is Thomas Vance. I am a doctor. May I examine the leg?" Helva had said, in the small, careful voice of a woman in considerable pain who was nonetheless an elder of her clan. "Doctor, please." He had examined the leg. The right hip was broken at the joint. The femur was angled outward perhaps 30 degrees from the line of the body. The skin had not been broken. He had set the bone on the spot with the help of Owen Gladys and the elder Brand son holding her at the shoulders and the knees, and he had splinted the leg between 2 carefully cut pieces of pine board from the Brand family's woodshed, and he had given her a small dose of laudanum from his bag for the pain. He had told the Brand family that Helva was going to be staying in their back bedroom for the next 6 weeks, that he was going to be staying at the farmhouse with her for the first 10 days to watch for the secondary infection, and that he was going to be riding back and forth between his own practice at Eastbrook and the Brand farmhouse at the rate of twice a week for the remaining 5 weeks. The Brand family had agreed. Thomas had stayed at the Brand farmhouse for the first 10 days, and the secondary infection had developed on the 7th day, and he had treated it across the 2nd week, and the infection had cleared by the end of that week. He had ridden back and forth between Eastbrook and the farmhouse twice a week for the remaining 5 weeks. He had taken no payment, because Helva had had no money with her at the moment of her accident, and because the Brand family had not had any money to spare to pay for an Ork traveler's medical care, and because in the Central Plains winter of 1864 it had not been the kind of country in which a country doctor took payment from an injured traveler. He had not entered the treatment in his book at home, because the treatment had been undertaken outside his ordinary practice, and because he had not wanted Margaret to ask him about a 6-week treatment that had brought no income into the household. He had paid for the splints and the laudanum and the bandages out of his own personal account in cash at the small territorial mercantile at the foothills village. The total of his personal expenditure had been $31.40. He had ridden Helva home to the Marrowstone settlement himself in a small, careful wagon he had borrowed from the Brand family at the warm gold hour of late afternoon of the 21st of January in 1865. "Ma'am," he had said at the gate of the settlement, "you are home." Helva had said, in the careful, low voice of a clan elder, "Dr. Vance, my clan is in your debt." "Mrs. Helva," he had said, "please, there is no debt." He had touched the brim of his hat and had turned his small chestnut mare and the borrowed wagon back toward the wagon road. Helva had recovered fully across the spring of 1865. She had walked with a small, careful limp on the right side for the remaining 8 years of her life, but the leg had carried her, and the hip had held. She had died in the autumn of 1873 at the age of 71, in her own bed at the Marrowstone settlement, with her daughter, Sarah, at her side. She had told Sarah the story of Dr. Thomas Vance in the 2nd week of October of that year, in the slow, careful manner of an old woman telling a story for the last time. Zira had told Corvin that night, "The debt is mine to discharge," Corvin had said. Zira had said, "Husband," the doctor told her there was no debt. "Wife," Corvin had said, "our clan does not accept that decision from the holder of the debt. The debt is the family's." Corvin had carried the obligation in his head for the next 5 years and 4 months. He had not wanted to ride to Eastbrook with a bag of money and say to Dr. Vance that the clan owed him for treating the doctor's wife's mother in 1864, because the doctor would have declined the discharge a second time, and the clan's tradition was that a discharge declined twice did not close the obligation, but made it heavier on the discharging family. He had decided to wait for the moment when the obligation could be discharged in a way that the doctor could not decline. He had been saving since the autumn of 1866 at the rate of about $70 a year for a small piece of land at the eastern edge of his stone masonry yard. By the autumn of 1878, he had saved $860 in cash, kept in a small iron strongbox at the back of the yard. He had heard in the 2nd week of December of 1878 that Dr. Vance had taken ill with a winter pneumonia. He had asked carefully at the village mercantile and the post office across the next 4 weeks. He had heard on the 4th of January in 1879 that Dr. Vance had died the previous evening. He had ridden to the funeral on the 7th. He had walked home without speaking to the widow, because the moment of the discharge had not yet arrived. He had ridden to the territorial capital on the 20th of January on the pretext of buying a new shipment of cut stone for the spring building season, and he had spent the 4 days asking careful questions at the Territorial Loan Office and at the 2 banks that had been doing business with Dr. Vance. He had learned by the 2nd day the names of the 3 creditors and the amounts owed. He had visited each creditor in person across the next 3 weeks. He had paid Mr. Reuben Stark of the Eastern Territorial Loan Office $270 in cash on the 14th of February. He had paid the Cattlemen's Bank $410 in cash on the 22nd of February. He had paid Mr. Jonas Pleak of Bridge Street $160 in cash on the 27th of February. He had instructed each creditor to mark the debt as paid in full and to send the widow a formal letter of release, and had asked each one specifically not to give his name to the widow. 2 of the 3 had agreed without question. Mr. Reuben Stark, who had been a private lender for the previous 30 years and who had a reputation for the small, careful honesty of a man who could not bring himself to lie when asked a direct question, had agreed with the slight hesitation of a man who had been making such a promise before. He had sent his formal letter of release to Mrs. Margaret Vance at Eastbrook on the 15th of February. The letter had stated, in the formal language of a private lender releasing an estate from a claim, that the debt of Dr. Thomas Vance had been paid in full, and that no further demand would be made. It had not stated who had paid it. The Cattlemen's Bank had sent its formal letter on the 23rd of February, and Mr. Jonas Pleak on the 28th, in the same essential content. Margaret had read the 3 letters in succession at her kitchen table on the 15th, the 23rd, and the 28th of February in 1879. She had not at first understood what she was reading. She had read each letter 3 times. She had compared each against her husband's statement, and the 3 debts had matched, and the 3 letters had each stated that no further demand would be made. She had folded all 3 letters carefully and had placed them in the small wooden drawer beside her husband's statement. Margaret had written on the morning of the 2nd of March to each of the 3 creditors, asking each one whether they could tell her in confidence who had paid the debt on behalf of her late husband's estate. The Cattlemen's Bank had written back on the 8th of March that the bank's policy was not to disclose the identity of a payer who had requested not to be named. Mr. Jonas Pleak of Bridge Street had written back on the 11th of March in similar terms, but had wished Mrs. Vance well in her widowhood. Mr. Reuben Stark of the Eastern Territorial Loan Office had written back on the 14th of March in a longer letter than the other 2, in which he had explained that the debt had been paid by an Orc gentleman in cash on the 14th of February, that the gentleman had given his name as Corvin of the Marrowstone clan, and had said he was a stonemason at Eastbrook, that the gentleman had asked specifically that no notice be given to the widow, but that Mr. Reuben Stark had not, after considering the matter for the previous month, been able to bring himself to refuse the question of a grieving widow. He had asked Mrs. Vance, at the close of the letter, to please not disclose his disclosure to Mr. Corvin, who he had said was a careful man and a private one. Margaret had read Mr. Reuben Stark's letter at her kitchen table on the 11th of June in 1879. She had read it 3 times. She had walked the 4 paces to the back parlor and had placed it in the small wooden drawer beside the other letters. She had walked back to the kitchen and had stood at the kitchen window for perhaps 10 minutes, looking out across the small kitchen garden and the small line of cottonwoods at the eastern fence and the small distant smoke of the stonemasonry yard at the eastern edge of the village beyond the cottonwoods. She had then taken down her brown wool work coat and her wide-brimmed dark felt hat from the wooden coat peg, and she had walked out of her own front door and down the small wagon road to the eastern edge of the village, and she had reached the gate of the stonemasonry yard at the warm gold hour of late afternoon of the 12th of June in 1879. She had stopped at the gate. The stonemasonry yard had been a small, open dirt yard, perhaps 40 feet square, with a small wooden workshed at the back and a low stone wall along the north and south sides, and a tall iron gate at the front. Inside at the center, on a low wooden trestle table, had been a single block of gray granite, perhaps 3 feet by 2 feet by 1 foot, partly cut to the shape of a wellhead. A tall, lean, adult Orc man stood at the table in a heavy brown leather mason's apron over a dark gray wool shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, with bright, vivid emerald green skin and long black hair tied back in a single thick braid and 2 small lower tusks, and large, prominent, pointed elf-like ears, working a small iron mason's chisel across the surface of the granite with careful, steady strokes of a small iron hammer. He had heard her at the gate at perhaps the 3rd stroke. He had set down the chisel and the hammer carefully on the trestle table. He had walked the 20 paces from the table to the gate. He had stopped perhaps 3 feet from her. "Mrs. Vance," he had said. Margaret Vance had said, "Mr. Corvin of the Marrowstone clan." Corvin had said, "Ma'am." Margaret had said, "Sir, on the 14th of February of this year, did you pay the sum of $270 in cash to Mr. Reuben Stark of the Eastern Territorial Loan Office against the personal debt of my late husband, Dr. Thomas Vance?" Corvin had looked at her across the iron gate for perhaps 4 seconds. "Mrs. Vance," he had said, "Yes." Margaret had said, "Sir, did you also pay on the 22nd and the 27th of February the sums of $410 and $160 respectively to the Cattlemen's Bank and to Mr. Jonas Pleak against the same debt?" Corvin had said, "Ma'am, yes." Margaret had said, "Sir, the total is $840. Corvin had said, "Ma'am, yes." Margaret had said, "Sir, please tell me why." Corvin had looked at her across the iron gate. "Mrs. Vance," he had said, "may I ask you to come inside the gate to the small wooden bench at the side of the workshed, and may I bring you a cup of cold water from the well, and may I tell you the answer to your question while you are sitting?" Margaret had said, "Yes." He had opened the iron gate. She had walked the 20 paces to the small wooden bench at the side of the workshed. She had sat. He had walked to the well at the back of the yard and had drawn a small cup of cold water in a brown ceramic mug and had brought it to her, and she had taken it in both her hands. He had then sat on the small wooden bench beside her at a careful distance of perhaps 3 feet, with his green painted hands resting on his own knees. He had said, in the careful low voice of a clan member discharging a small careful piece of clan accounting, "Mrs. Vance, in the winter of 1864, my wife's mother, a woman named Helva of the Marrowstone, was traveling alone in the eastern foothills on a clan errand of trade in carved stone. He had told Margaret the story of the broken hip and Owen Gladys the freighter and the Brand farmhouse and Dr. Thomas Vance and the 6 weeks of treatment and the ride home. He had told her that Helva had lived 9 more years and had died at home in 1873, that she had told the story to her daughter Sarah in the last weeks of her life, that Sarah had told him, and that he had carried the obligation for 15 years and 4 months, waiting for the moment to discharge it in a way the doctor could not decline. He had told her that the moment had been wrong while the doctor was alive, because the doctor had declined the discharge once at the Marrowstone settlement, and the clan's tradition was that a discharge declined twice did not close the obligation but made it heavier. He had told her of the doctor's death on the 4th of January, the funeral on the 7th, the ride to the territorial capital on the 20th, 2 days of careful questions, the 3 creditors paid each in cash from his own savings, and the asking of each not to give his name. He had told her that Mr. Reuben Stark had agreed with hesitation. Margaret had listened with the careful, slow attention of a woman who had been keeping accounts for 32 years and who had been waiting 4 months for the explanation. "Sir," she had said, "the savings you used, what had you been saving them for?" Corvin had paused. "Mrs. Vance," he had said, "a small piece of land at the eastern edge of this yard, for the expansion of my operation." Margaret had said, "Sir, how many years have you been saving?" Corvin had said 12 years. Margaret had said, "Mr. Corvin of the Marrowstone clan, I will repay the $840 to you over the next 10 years at $7 a month, beginning on the 1st of July of this year, and I will sign a promissory note to that effect this evening." Corvin had looked at her for perhaps 8 seconds. He had said, in the careful low voice of a clan member who had been waiting his whole adult life to say the line his clan's tradition had given him, "Mrs. Vance, my clan does not collect twice on the same debt." Margaret had said, "Sir," Corvin had said, "the debt was discharged on the 14th of February, the 22nd of February, and the 27th of February of this year. The debt is closed. Ma'am, I will not accept the $7. Margaret had set the brown ceramic mug down on the small wooden bench between them. "Sir," she had said, "you have given me back my house." Corvin had said, "Ma'am, you may keep your house." Margaret had said, "Sir, thank you." Corvin had said, "Mrs. Vance, please." She had risen from the small wooden bench. He had risen with her. She had walked the 20 paces to the iron gate, and he had walked beside her, and he had opened the gate for her at the road, and she had walked through, and she had turned at the road and had looked back at him at the gate. "Mr. Corvin," she had said, "may I ask you one further question?" Corvin had said, "Ma'am." Margaret had said, "The small piece of land at the eastern edge of your yard, is it still for sale?" Corvin had said, "Ma'am, I do not know." Margaret had said, "Sir, if it is, please reserve it for me. I will be saving for it at the rate of $7 a month for the next 10 years, and I will deliver it to you in cash for the price of $840 on the 11th of June in 1889, and you will accept the cash, and you will buy the small piece of land, and then you will own both halves of the yard." Corvin had looked at her for perhaps 4 seconds. He had said, "Mrs. Vance, the clan accounting of the Marrowstone does not forbid the discharge of an obligation in the reverse direction in a separate transaction 10 years later." Margaret had said, "Sir, I thought it might not." Corvin had said, "Ma'am, the 11th of June in 1889. Margaret had said, "Sir, the 11th of June in 1889. She had walked the small wagon road back to the southern edge of the village in the warm gold late afternoon light. She had sold the medical practice in the summer of 1879 to a young doctor from the eastern counties for $780. She had used $420 to pay off the remaining mortgage on the small frame house. She had used $80 to open a new account at the Eastbrook Savings Society in the name of the Marrowstone Clan Land Fund. She had taken in 2 boarders from the territorial school at $15 a month each, and the bookkeeping position at the village mercantile at $12 a month. She had deposited $7 a month in the Marrowstone Clan Land Fund for the next 10 years, and one day she had made a careful study of Marrowstone Clan culture across those 10 years, reading what she could find, writing to a territorial historian named Theodore Marsh at the Capitol, corresponding with 2 Marrowstone elders by letter, and by 1889 she had become the small village's quiet local authority on Marrowstone Clan accounting traditions, though she had published nothing. She had delivered $840 in cash to the iron gate of the stonemasonry yard on the morning of the 11th of June in 1889. Corvin had accepted the cash. He had bought the small piece of land at the eastern edge of his yard from the village of Eastbrook in the autumn of 1889 and had expanded his operation. He had carved a small, careful stone plaque in the spring of 1890 that he had set into the stone wall of the new section of the yard with 3 words cut into the granite. The 3 words had read, "Marrowstone Clan Yard." Margaret Ainsworth Vance had continued to live in the small frame house for the next 19 years. She had continued the bookkeeping at the village mercantile until 1902, when she was 74, and had finally retired. She had continued to greet Corvin of the Marrowstone Clan at the village mercantile and the post office for the rest of her life, in the small, careful manner of 2 professional people who had once concluded a piece of clan business across an iron gate. They had not had a long conversation again. Margaret had died in the autumn of 1908 at the age of 80, in her own bed in the small frame house, with a small wooden box of letters at her bedside. She had been buried in the small Methodist plot beside Thomas. Corvin, 76 and still working, had carved the date of her death into the gravestone he had carved for her 14 years earlier. He had died in the winter of 1912 at the age of 80 at his own kitchen table of a quiet old age. His clan had brought his body back to the Marrowstone settlement. The stonemasonry yard had passed to his eldest apprentice. The yard was still operating in the present day, run by Corvin's apprentice's grandchildren, and the small stone plaque that read Marrowstone Clan Yard was still set in the wall. The Marrowstone Clan records were maintained in the present day in the clan archives at the Eastern River and included an entry in the careful, even hand of a clan accountant in the spring of 1879. Obligation to Dr. Thomas Vance of Eastbrook for the treatment of Helva of the Marrowstone, winter of 1864, discharged in full by Corvin of the Marrowstone, February of 1879. Sum, $840. Status, closed. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like. It helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. The Orc Keeper.